The next few stories are from the same person, Scott Stiesel, who shares with us today a few of their scary experiences in Ireland. They're titled Tales from an Irish Traveler. Number 1. The Kelpie. This happened in 1965, or rather, it began then. In Celtic legend, there is an evil creature that lives in bodies of water called Kelpie, or water horse. I believe my uncle and I saw one on a small lake 20 years apart, and the consequences changed the lives of everyone involved forever. In 1965, my uncle and 2 of his friends decided to go by the lake to swim. They were avid swimmers. First, they wanted to gather wood and oil drums from a nearby derelict factory to build a raft so that they could go to the small pile of rocks known as the island. As they were building the raft, my uncle would notice splashes in the water as if something had been thrown in. My uncle accused his mates of simply trying to wind him up. They all denied doing it, so everyone was thinking everyone else was trying to scare them. They quickly finished the raft and launched it into the water. After a chilly afternoon relaxing on the raft in the still water, they decided to get closer to the island. Near the island, they felt a pull or tug on the raft from underneath, then a violent rocking motion until one of his friends suddenly fell in. My uncle leaned over the side to haul his mate back on, and that's when he saw something under the water. Shockingly, this thing had its arms around the waist of his friend, something that had the face of an ugly horse with eyes bulging and a weird-looking mane, as my uncle put it. Try as much as he could, my uncle and his other friends became tired, and they watched their mate slip away from them below the water. Their friend's body was recovered the next day. After my uncle told me what he personally saw in the water, he swore me to secrecy, just wanting everyone else to believe it was simply a tragic accident. My uncle hadn't told me about this incident until after I was involved in a similar one, 20 years later. It was the summer of 1985. I was in Scotland, where there was another rare mini heat wave. I was 12 years old, and it was too hot for school, so around 10 of us bunked off school and made our way to the lake, or loch. We had a good day making campfires, and we found rope and made a swing. All that time I was feeling uneasy, as if I was being watched, so I told a couple of my mates. But they laughed at me, putting it down to some of us being naked or just in our underwear. But I just couldn't shake that feeling. As we were on the swing, one of us noticed splashes in the water. "Big bloody pike, that," one of my mates said. "Nah," said another. "One of you is throwing stuff." After we got bored on the rope swing, some of the older lads, who must have been around 15, decided to see who could swim out farther and farther to a tiny island. Well, more a pile of rocks further out. I was younger and not a strong swimmer, so as the older boys were doing this, I just sat on the rocks on the shore, dangling my feet in the water, and occasionally lowering myself to the waist. Suddenly, I felt something grab hold of my leg, something that felt like fingers, but with the texture of slime. It had a powerful grip too, but as I was trying to pull myself up, I said, "Mother of Jesus," or something panicky like that. And it suddenly released its hold. My friends heard the commotion and saw me struggling. They swam over and asked me what happened. I told them, but they laughed at me again, telling me it was just a crab, until someone pointed out finger-like marks on my leg. Crabs don't do that. One of the older lads said it was either leeches or an eel, maybe, and being younger, we believed it. Or at least I pretended to believe it, for fear of ridicule. The feeling I had of being watched grew stronger after that, but it felt like there was anger to it. The air felt foreboding. I was so disturbed I just sat on top of a large rock by the edge and watched the older lads resume their macho game of who could swim the farthest. Then it happened. One of the boys furthest out, at least twice as far as the others, began screaming, "Help! Something's got my legs!" From my vantage point, he looked like he was fighting against something, and it looked like something just under the water, silvery but in a definite shape, was grabbing hold of him. The boy released another horrendous scream, continuing to splash and gargle in the water, until there was silence. The water became still, and the silver, shadowy figure was gone. I didn't tell anyone about the silver shadow or gray outline that I saw. I was too scared, and I knew they wouldn't believe me. Divers recovered my friend's body that night, and we were told by the police he had either gotten a cramp or he had tangled himself in something underwater and drowned. Several years later, in an English city, in a random bar, I surprisingly met up with one of the lads from that day, the one closest in the water at the time to our friend who had perished. We chatted about the past, and the conversation turned to what happened that day. He swore me to secrecy like my uncle did before me. He said he told me he had felt hands, says he felt something swim around them. He saw flashes of silvery battleship gray skin moving underneath the water. He felt a tug once, but said, "Oh God," as soon as it touched him, and then the feeling vanished. He went on to tell me that he thought he saw gray silver arms through the splashing water on my drowned mate's body. He swears he saw what looked to be the back of a horse's head in the splashing water. He told me he didn't say anything at the time because he thought the others would claim he was a lunatic. Oddly enough, this friend drowned shortly after he told me this story. He had gone on a fishing trip somewhere in the UK. All these events, including my friend on the fishing trip, are they due to the Kelpie? Was it truly the water horse? Number 2. The Shadow Person. I was around 15 or 16, looking after a house in a village in Ireland with my mate. We were passing time by watching TV. The first few days had been uneventful, though I did feel something weird about the place. Now you might think I could chalk that up to anything, being in a new place, eating something bad, but that wasn't all that was going on. While I was in that house, sometimes I would hear doors opening and closing, knocks and bangs on the wall, all while I was either alone or with my friend, so it couldn't have been either of us. On that particular night, the TV suddenly turned itself off when the remote was sitting right in front of us on the coffee table, and the power hadn't gone out. There was something there with us, but it wasn't going to show itself yet. That night, I was in bed feeling really apprehensive. So I stayed up in bed reading when I heard a loud pop and a blood-curdling scream coming from my friend in the next room. I quickly got up and ran to his room, flicking on the hallway light in the process. But when I grabbed his room door handle, it was red hot, and it took all my force to open the door. As soon as I got in, I stopped in my tracks. Glass from the 3 bulbs on the ceiling light was all over the floor, and my friend was curled up in the corner shouting for this thing to go, pointing to directly behind me. At the same time, something tried to push me onto the glass from behind. I immediately turned and threw a punch, but what it connected with was nothing but air and the sight of a distinct shadow of a person. A shadow that lacked actual features, and it only had contours. The thing was more like a shadow on a digital TV when it glitches, or someone silhouetted by a flickering old-style fluorescent light. I didn't feel anything solid, just the rush of air past my fist and a weird electrical shock mixed with an ice-cold feeling, something that was instinctively repulsive. Then the shadow vanished. My mate yelled, "Let's get out now," so we went to my room, picked up some cigarettes, and ran downstairs. We went out to the back garden, which had a large decked patio, fenced off, then a 10 to 15 foot drop to a lower garden with bushes and a greenhouse below. After we calmed down, we chatted about my past experiences and what happened. Suddenly, my friend fell silent, eyes wide looking up to the wall to my right. I turned, and we saw the shadow person slip, jump, and almost flicker off the wall, then rush right up to me. Instinct told me I was being attacked. I felt that electric shock, ice-cold feeling, this time in the shape of a hand, as something grabbed my face. I swung my fists around, trying to attack. I panicked, and I began to pray to my ancestors, using protective calls that I'd learned being a full-blooded gypsy. I must have struggled for a few minutes, all the time feeling that horrendous ice-cold electric shock, when suddenly I was pushed through the wooden fence on the decking and then through the glass house, the glass breaking into shards and falling all around me. I heard a guttural scream from apparently the shadow person, and I got a massive electrical jolt type thing. I looked toward the shadow with the air taken from me from the fall. The figure flicked like a dodgy strip light and seemed to dissipate and dissolve at the same time. I realized that I was completely unharmed. No cuts, no grazes, no bruises, just the wind taken from me. How can anyone fall through a wooden fence, fall 10 to 15 feet, then fall through a glass house unscathed? Somehow, I did. I picked my way out to get to my friend, who seemed to be physically ill. I made him a cup of tea to help him feel better, and eventually I got his perspective of what happened. He says the shadowy figure, when I began to call out to my ancestors, began to convulse. My prayers had maybe saved my life. We spent the rest of the night awake, as we could not sleep. When the house owner returned, we told him of what happened. The house owner already knew about this, and wasn't even surprised when I showed him the fence and glass house being broken. He says that a plague-like spirit had been haunting this place, and after speaking to some travelers in the nearby town, who gave him a method of trying to get rid of it, it only made things worse. The house still stands. The owner's still there. I've been back. But he sleeps peacefully these days. According to the owners, ever since that night with my altercation, the place is completely different and feels like a brand new home. And number 3, attacked by Fae. I was out on a long walk with my father through the countryside. We were looking in the fields where the potatoes had been picked, and would gather the ones left over and discarded by the pickers to take home for the coming winter. Gradually, we would work further and further apart, then back together down the next row. It was a slate gray day, a bit cold. The air was still with a little mist, and there were hundreds of crows silently eyeing us from a nearby clump of woods. A bit creepy, so a reason to get on with the job and get home. As I'm bent over gradually filling my little bag, I feel anxious, like I'm being watched. But not from the crows. It felt like I was being watched from somewhere else, somewhere I couldn't pinpoint. I tried to shrug it off. I bent over again and carried on. Suddenly, I realize there's a shadow over me, and it makes me stand upright, feeling a bit paranoid. I was just about to shout for my dad when I felt two vice-like grips on my shoulders, and something began to pull me right off the ground. I looked up, and I saw this huge winged creature. It was dark and had leathery skin, with a huge beak and eyes. I instinctively yelled for my dad, who I heard holler back at me, "What the hell?" I was now at least 2 feet off the ground when I noticed lots of crows flying past my face, dive-bombing at this thing, swooping and attacking it. It dropped me from a height of about 6 feet, and I landed, bruised and shocked. As I watched the thing depart, there were more and more crows leaving their roosts, attacking and chasing this thing away. My father came running after me. He checked that I was okay and asked me about it. He had seen me off the ground as I was lifted. He saw the crows going nuts around something, but he didn't see the creature, just a gray swirling mist and the crows diving at it. We quickly picked up our bags of potatoes and headed home. Being travelers, we didn't report it, because we never really trust authority. When I got back home, there were tears just on the back of my clothes. This creature tore through 3 layers of clothes and cut through my skin as well, and it caused bruising on my shoulders where I was grabbed. My father told my mother and grandmother about the incident, and my grandmother told my mother not to treat or wash the cuts and bruises. My grandmother hurried out and came back later with a bag full of wild plants and cooked up some foul-smelling paste, which she prayed over, cooled, and applied to my cuts and bruises before sending me to bed. The following morning, my grandmother and mother checked my injuries, and they were completely gone. Many years later, my grandmother told me that potion only works on wounds inflicted by fae folk, or fairy people, or animals and things that are outside our control. A few people suggested it was an eagle, but where this took place, there are no eagles, and what I saw that day was no eagle for sure. An Irish Traveler's Tale from Scott's Diesel. I don't know where to start, except that I've had paranormal experiences all my life. The paranormal is pretty much accepted in my community. I remember I sat outside in a gloriously sunny day in Scotland with my great-grandfather, who was a man of few words. I was 5 at the time. When he suddenly told me to listen carefully to what he had to say, I knew it was something that I should pay attention to. He said to me, "Growing up, you'll see, feel, and hear things you can't explain. Some of it will be scary, and sometimes other people may not see the same thing. But never be afraid, and don't question it. You'll understand when you're older, and your long-gone family will see you again one day. Okay? You'll know what I mean when it happens, when you're a man. Now, let's go in and have some food." I had a few incidents happen since then, but one in particular really springs to mind. My great-grandfather had passed that winter, but his words from that day are tattooed into my memory. It was the summer, and I was roaming around the countryside. In our culture, you went out in the morning to play and didn't come back until around tea time. This was in rural, remote Scotland in the 70s. I went for an adventure by the RAF base and ultimately got lost, partly because I was daydreaming, and partly because I was interested in the nature around here. I was in a wooded area, a place I didn't recognize. I was beginning to feel scared, but after a bit of searching, I came upon a clearing with long grass. It had a lovely summer day vibe to it, so I stopped for a moment. I remember it clearly, the dappled sun, the hum of insects, and then the ambience was broken by a strange voice from behind me. "Are you lost, young man?" I turn, and I see a man in a gray pilot's uniform, RAF. I wasn't scared. I felt what we would call good vibes from him. So I answered, "Yes." "Take my hand. I'll show you the way home." He led me through the woods, always staying a bit in front and beckoning me. He finally led me to a field of wheat, which we would have to walk through to get to the road. On the way, he talked about how he missed his family, how he would one day hope to see his kids again. In hindsight, this was a strange comment, considering things to come. I suddenly noticed he wasn't making a trail through the wheat like I was. He laughed, and he told me, "If you keep going, there's a break in the hedge a small man like you could get through." A buzzard or hawk made a noise overhead. Then he pointed at it. I watched for a second or two, and when my eyes came back down, the man in the RAF uniform was gone. There was nowhere in the field for him to hide, but there was no trace of him, and none of the wheat had been laid down in his wake. I didn't panic, though. I carried on as he told me. I got back home, and all the adults were at work except my grandmother. So I told her my tale, but she quickly dismissed it. That night I was in bed, and the adults were sat around outside, gathered around a campfire. I overheard my grandmother repeating my story to them, and the others commented, It started." My grandmother then said, He's got a gift." I went back in and dozed off. I've had many more experiences throughout my life, some absolutely terrifying, where I've literally fought for my life, places I'll never return to, moments where I should have died, but somehow come out completely unscathed. I've had partners and friends who have experienced activity when I'm around. If you want to hear more of my stories, let me know, because after 40 years, I've got plenty of experiences to share.